So what I want to attempt to do in this portion of the video is to demonstrate my process for selecting a comic to be sent in to CGC. And I should say, not just any comic, because we're not just talking about any comic. What we're talking about is trying to identify a potential 9.8 candidate, trying to identify a comic that can be sent in and has a pretty good shot at coming back at a 9.8. That is essentially what we're talking about. And oftentimes when I am sending in a comic for a pre-screening at a 9.8, I'm typically sending in modern comics. And I typically have a couple of copies of that modern comic available to me so that I can do a comparison and contrast, right? Try to identify one of these comics that has, again, the potential of actually coming back at a 9.8. And so what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to walk you through that process. Now, these 3 books that I have here are 3 copies of Spider-Man from the 90s. And I just kind of eyeballed these books from my bin and grabbed 3 of them. I probably have 3 or 4 more other copies of this, gold cover from Spider-Man from back in the day. But I grabbed 3 just for the purpose of just being able to demonstrate the process that I go through. And so what you're going to see me do is basically, evaluate these comics and try to basically rank them. That is essentially what I'm going to be doing, and ranking them based upon the number of defects that they actually have or don't have. That's basically the scale that I'm going to be using. is also not as defective as the front, but there's lots of defects here. So with my eye, I'm actually able to see probably 8 spine ticks down the side of this book. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see them on camera here, but there are a significant of color breaking ticks that go down the spine. You can see one by Spidey's foot and one by Spidey's head on the spine. That's just a couple of the ones. There's one essentially where my finger is. There are numerous spine ticks down this book. And this book is definitely more defective than the first one. So if we're just doing just straight ranking right now, it is definitely 1 followed by 2 in that order. So this book is not as defective as the second one, but it's not as clean as the first, just based upon what I'm seeing on the front cover. Okay, so this book has a pretty large divot right where the light is, right where the O in the your is located, and there's also some spine ticks on the back side. It's pretty hard to identify color breaking creases on white covers, at least for me, but this book appears to have a couple of creases on the back side that could break color. Okay, so based upon just the look that we did here, we can probably put this book clearly in number 1 in the first position. This book is number 2, and this book is at the bottom. So just based upon what we're seeing here, I'm seeing pressable defects in these 2 books. This book probably has the fewest amount of pressable defects and the fewest amount of non-pressable defects out of all 3. So the process doesn't stop with just what we did a few moments ago. The next part of this thing is where I literally stack the books on top of each other. And I basically look at the left side of the book going one to the other, and then I look at the right side of the book, looking from one to the other, and then I flip them over and I basically do the same thing. I'm basically looking a little bit closer at the spines of the book and also the corners of the book to make sure that this book is still the best of the ones that we have here on the table. And again, I feel pretty comfortable with that, but it doesn't hurt to take a little bit more time to actually do it. Okay, so if you look at these 3 books that are stacked here, what you'll see is that one of them has a wrap that is slightly off, and that's the book in the first position, right? You can see that there's actually some white from the back cover that can actually be seen on the front cover. So we definitely have a little bit of a miswrap with the first book. If you look at the third book, the one that is furthest to the left, you can actually see that book has a massive color breaking ding in that left hand corner, and also a pretty large spine tick versus the other books. And so again, by just doing a comparison of these, you can actually see some things that maybe you would not have noticed that miswrap had you just looked at this book in isolation. But when you look at the 3 of them together, you see that book is different. What could also have happened is you could have stacked these 3 books together and realized that a miswrap is pretty common. If you have 3 books and all 3 of them have basically the same issue, that also tells you a little bit of something about the book. And so if you look in this left-hand corner, not sure if you should be able to see that. If you look here in this left-hand corner, what you can see is that the first 2 books on the right-hand side actually have essentially like a little bit of a bindery tear almost. And the question becomes, even the third one has it even more significantly. The question becomes, is that a pretty standard thing for this particular run, or were these books just mishandled at some point? Again, by looking at multiple books, you're able to kind of determine whether there are handling defects or whether these are printer defects. Printer defects, if you see those, are important because typically CGC actually discounts those, or in other words, they actually ignore those printer defects. I'm noticing something here on book one that I did not see before. There is a line around Spider-Man's arm there. I'm not even sure if you can actually see that. Yep, it's right there. You can see it. That line right there. That is one of the noticeable defects in this book that, again, I believe it should be a pressable defect. So that doesn't scare me off. Now, here's the thing. When you look at these three books on the right side, what do you notice? What you notice here is that all of the books are slightly underwrapped. There's a slight underwrap here with each one of these books where you can actually see the pages of the comic below, which is interesting, again, because if you just looked at one of these books in isolation, you would imagine that this book is miswrapped or underwrapped. But again, if you're looking at all three of these here, it seems to be that maybe that was a pretty common thing at the time, because every single one of them essentially has the same amount of underwrap. Or one might look at this and say that the book has been trimmed, but again, three books, same thing, probably a printer thing. And on the back here, with the bottom book being the third ranking book, you can actually see that a little bit of the cover here is actually wrapped to the back side of this book, which is not what you're seeing on the first two books. So again, this third book is probably completely out. But again, just an illustration of some differences that can be identified when you take the time to actually compare these books one to another. We don't stop with just what we've done so far. We go a little bit deeper. And what I want to do is really to take some time to go through this book and actually flip through the book and see whether there are actually defects inside of the comic that could be an issue, whether it be a dog-eared page, a missing page, a torn page, a signature, whether there's water stains on the inside. The cover looks pretty good, but what's going on below the cover? You can see that those pages are pretty darn white. This book probably will come back at white pages because this book clearly has been taken care of by illustration of the way that the page looks. There's no browning. There's no brittleness to these pages. They are nice looking pages. If this were an older book, what I would also be doing here is actually looking for a couple of things. I would be looking to see whether the staples are tight. They're pretty tight on this modern book, but I would be looking for the staples, whether they're tight, whether there's holes there. Inside the inside cover, I would also be looking for color touch, because that's another big thing. Inside the cover, you would actually see some of the ink that may have been applied on the front cover bleeding through the back cover. So that's another thing that I would be looking for if this were an older book. What's funny is I actually picked up probably 30 copies of Arachnophobia. Bought a collection that actually had 30 copies of this movie adapted comic in it, and I never noticed this ad before until literally just this moment. All right, so the visual inspection of the inside of the book checks out. A lot of people count pages and things like that. I didn't do that with this one. But again, this book checks out. The inside is pretty darn nice. White pages, everything is there. Nothing is torn, nothing is loose, nothing is written on. And again, I feel very confident that this book could potentially come back at a 9.8. What I would do at this point is I would basically press the book out. I would press the book out and I would try to specifically do a couple of things to address some of the defects that we saw on that front cover. And if you're curious what those things are, you can definitely take a look at my pressing series where I talk about how to press out defects in the cover. But very briefly, what I essentially would do would be to put a backing board behind the front cover of this book. I would insert multiple Teflon sheets and or parchment paper into the comic to prevent the pages from sticking together, because there's the potential that could happen here. But I would press this book out, and I would then, after it comes out of the press, I would spend some more time examining the book, making sure that the defects that we saw before have been addressed, and also making sure that there aren't other defects that have now been identified because the comic has been pressed. One of the things that I've learned is that sometimes when you press the comic, you see things that you may not have noticed before. So I would not automatically just press it and then send it off to CGC. I would take some time again to examine the book one more time, the same way that we did here, to see whether there are any other defects that may need to be addressed. And specifically, some things that I would be looking for is on that spine. I would be looking at that spine to make sure that there are no color breaking creases going down that spine, because this is a black cover, essentially a dark book, and these books are notorious for having spine text. That's just the way that black covers are. And so I would definitely take a little time to examine that again after the comic has been pressed. So there you go. That is essentially the process by which I would try to identify 9.8 candidates for the purpose of submission for grading. It is basically a ranking thing where I'm basically looking at multiple copies and I'm ranking the books out, and I'm landing on one and I'm moving that one book forward. So I hope you found this video helpful. Certainly, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop them into the comment section. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so at Regie Collects on Instagram, at regiecollects@gmail.com. Take care.